I never thought the woman my son married would one day lock me in my own bathroom. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend, just the two of us at home. I'd spent the morning fixing the broken fence, and all I wanted was a hot shower to ease the ache in my back. 10 minutes. That's all it took for her to start pounding on the door, screaming that I was wasting hot water. Then I heard the click, the key turning from the outside. For 2 days, I sat on the cold tile floor. No food, no chair, only the drip of the faucet and the sound of her laughter echoing from the kitchen. She told the neighbors I'd gone to visit a friend. She even played music to drown out my knocks. When she finally opened the door, I didn't say a word. I smiled. I thanked her for the dinner she cooked that night. And the next morning, while she was at work, I began my own kind of revenge, quiet, legal, and absolute. By the time she realized what I'd done, I was already gone. The house sold. The country a memory. And on my phone, 109 missed calls. My name is Evelyn Parker. I'm 67 years old, a retired accountant who spent more years cleaning offices and packing warehouses than sitting behind a desk. Most people would call me a survivor. I suppose that's true, though I've come to learn that survival isn't always the same as living. People see the lines on my face and think time put them there, but really, they were carved by sacrifice, the kind that doesn't just take your youth, it takes your sense of self. When I was 32, my husband David died suddenly of a heart attack. One moment he was there reading the newspaper at the kitchen table, and the next he was gone, his coffee still warm. Our son Mark was 8. I remember sitting on the floor that night with him in my arms, listening to the rain hit the windows. He kept asking when his father would wake up. I didn't have an answer, so I held him tighter and promised, "You'll be okay, sweetheart. I'll take care of you." I didn't know then that those words would become my entire identity. Life after David's death didn't come with a pause button. The bills kept arriving, the rent kept climbing, and the world didn't slow down to make room for my grief. I had studied accounting before Mark was born, but without recent experience, no one wanted to hire a widowed mother who couldn't stay late at the office. So I took whatever jobs I could find. By day, I cleaned houses. By night, I stocked shelves at a grocery store. There were mornings when I'd catch my reflection in the bus window, half awake, wondering whose tired face was staring back. It's funny how quickly dignity becomes a luxury when you have a hungry child. I learned to stretch every dollar skip breakfast so Mark could have lunch money, patch my shoes with tape smile when the power company gave me an extra week to pay the bill. At first I told myself it was temporary, that I'd find a better job soon. But months turned into years, and soon I stopped thinking about better. My only measure of success was seeing Mark's face light up when he got a new pair of sneakers, or hearing him laugh when I managed to surprise him with a used baseball glove. He'll never go without, I used to tell myself. That became my motto, my promise, my curse. I built my life around that sentence like it was scripture. I told myself it was love. And maybe it was, at least in the beginning. But love, I've learned, can change its shape when you give too much of it away. It starts as warmth, something that holds you up. Then slowly, it becomes a weight pressing down on your shoulders. You don't notice it happening until one day you realize you can't stand up straight anymore. Mark grew fast. Too fast. One day he was sitting at the kitchen table swinging his legs, and the next, he was taller than me, his voice deeper. He stopped leaving notes on the counter and started leaving dishes in the sink. I'd come home from work to find the TV on and the door to his room closed. I'd stand there in the hallway listening to the muffled sound of his laughter with friends and tell myself this was normal, that he was becoming independent. That's what I wanted, wasn't it? For him to need me less, but needing less turned into noticing less. He didn't ask how my day was anymore. He didn't see the way my hands trembled from fatigue when I served dinner. When he did look at me, it was with a kind of pity, like I was someone fragile. It stung more than I let on. I'd smile and tell him everything was fine, then cry quietly in the laundry room. Love makes you hide your pain so it doesn't become someone else's burden. When Mark got into college, it felt like a miracle. I'd saved every extra penny I could for years, sometimes skipping medicine or heat in the winter, just to make sure he wouldn't start his life in debt. The day he left for campus, I watched the bus disappear down the street and felt something inside me unravel. For 18 years, every decision I made had revolved around him. Now that he was gone, I didn't know where to place my hands, my thoughts, my purpose. I tried to build a new routine, took a part-time job at the library, started attending a church group. But I never felt like I belonged anywhere that didn't have Mark in it. I'd call him every Sunday just to hear his voice and try not to sound lonely. "I'm doing fine," I'd say, even when the silence of the apartment made my chest ache. He'd sound distracted sometimes, eager to hang up. I told myself that was good. He was busy. He was living. That's what I wanted. Still, I couldn't stop giving. I sent care packages, money, little reminders of home. He'd thank me, but I could tell he didn't understand how much of myself I was still pouring into his life. Maybe he never could. Children aren't supposed to see their parents' sacrifices. That's the way love works. Invisible, quiet, constant. When he graduated, I thought maybe finally I could rest. I bought a small cake, invited him over, and told him how proud I was. He hugged me, and for a moment I felt like the years of struggle had been worth it. But even as I smiled, I felt a strange emptiness stirring beneath my ribs. I'd built my whole life on keeping someone else safe. What happens when that person doesn't need you anymore? It wasn't Mark's fault. He was just living his life the way any young man should. The problem was me. I didn't know how to live mine. I'd spent decades defining myself by what I could give. And when you do that long enough, giving becomes your only language. I thought it made me strong, but in truth it made me dependent on being needed, on being useful. Looking back, I can see how it all led to what came later, the misunderstanding, the resentment, the betrayal. It didn't happen overnight. It grew in the quiet spaces between gratitude and guilt, between what I gave and what they thought they were owed. Love, I've realized, is not just what binds us. It's also what traps us when we forget who we are outside of it. I didn't know love could become a shackle. That thought followed me for months after Mark's wedding, echoing in my mind whenever I tried to sleep. It wasn't bitterness, not exactly just an ache I couldn't name. I'd built my entire life around giving, and now that my son had a wife, a career, and a future of his own, I didn't know where I fit anymore. I wanted to stay close, but not in the way. So when I used my life savings to buy a small house for them, I told myself it was one last act of love, the final chapter of my duty as a mother. I chose a modest 2-story home in a quiet suburban neighborhood, 3 bedrooms, a sunny kitchen, and a patch of grass out front that reminded me of the yard Mark used to play in as a boy. It wasn't extravagant, but it felt solid, safe, permanent. The kind of place where life could finally feel settled. When I signed the papers, the real estate agent asked how I wanted the title listed. I thought for a moment and said joint tenancy with right of survivorship, Evelyn and Mark Parker. It seemed right. I wanted him to feel secure, to know that one day when I was gone, it would all be his. I didn't think twice about it. I'd worked my whole life for him. This was just the proof of that promise. When I handed Mark the keys, he hugged me tight, his face bright with gratitude. "Mom, you didn't have to do this," he said, but I could tell he was happy. Samantha stood beside him smiling, though her eyes flickered with something I couldn't read. "It's beautiful, Evelyn," she said politely. "You really didn't have to go to all this trouble." I brushed it off, laughing. Oh, it's no trouble. You're starting a life together. Every couple deserves a home. I didn't notice then how tightly she held Mark's arm, or how her smile faded when I mentioned both our names on the deed. I moved into the smallest room upstairs, the one that faced the backyard. It felt natural to stay. After all, I'd always imagined being part of Mark's life, helping when I could. I paid for most of the utilities and groceries at first, not because they asked, but because that's what mothers do. It felt good to still be useful. I cooked dinners, tended the small garden, and tried to give them space. Samantha seemed polite enough, though sometimes her compliments had sharp edges. "You're very independent for your age," she said once while watching me scrub the sink. "Most women would have retired by now." I smiled, pretending not to feel the sting in her tone. One evening about a month after they moved in, Mark and I were sitting at the table going over some papers when I decided to tell him about the life insurance policy David had left behind. "There's something you should know," I said. "Your father left a trust fund $200,000. It's in your name, but it won't be released until after I'm gone." Mark's eyes widened, surprised, but touched. "Mom, I didn't know," he said softly. "You've done enough for me already." I waved it off. "It's not about enough. Your father wanted to make sure you'd always have something solid to fall back on. I kept it safe all these years." I didn't notice Samantha standing by the doorway pretending to check her phone. She didn't say a word, but when our eyes met, she smiled a slow, unreadable smile that made me shift uncomfortably in my chair. A few days later, I caught her in the living room with a stack of files spread across the coffee table. She said she was reorganizing the bills, but I recognized the envelope from the lawyer's office among the papers. "Oh, I was just cleaning up," she said, quickly closing the folder. I told her it was fine, trusting she meant no harm. But that night, I lay awake, replaying the moment, the way her fingers lingered on the documents longer than necessary. Later that week, I heard her on the phone in the kitchen after she thought I'd gone to bed. Her voice was low, urgent. "Yes, I saw it. It says she has to voluntarily relinquish." "What does that mean exactly?" There was a pause. I strained to hear my heart pounding, so if she signs it away or if she's no longer around it, passes directly to him. Another silence, then a faint laugh. "Good to know." I stayed still in my room, afraid to move, afraid even to breathe. The words sank into me slowly, heavy and cold. I told myself I must have misunderstood. Samantha was practical, maybe too curious, but she wouldn't mean harm. Still, something about her tone, the way she said, "if she's no longer around," sent a shiver through me. The next morning, she was cheerful, almost overly so. She brought me coffee and asked about my garden as if nothing had happened. I watched her carefully as she chatted about paint colors and kitchen renovations, and I realized how little I truly knew her. Mark adored her. That much was clear, and I wanted to believe she loved him too. But there was something beneath her calm exterior, something calculating, restless. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was being paranoid. After all, Samantha had a demanding job, long hours, a sharp mind for numbers. Maybe she'd just been trying to understand our finances better. But sometimes when I caught her looking at me from across the room, her expression was hard to read. Part pity, part impatience. Like she was waiting for something to change. Weeks passed and the house began to feel different. Colder. Samantha started making small suggestions about energy bills, grocery costs, even how long I used the shower. "We need to be mindful, Evelyn," she'd say sweetly, but her words carried the weight of authority. I laughed it off, though every comment left a mark. Looking back now, I can see how the pieces were falling into place one small moment at a time. The house, the trust fund, that clause I'd never thought twice about, voluntarily relinquish. It sounded so harmless, so procedural. I didn't realize that piece of paper made me a target. Looking back, that was when the air in the house began to change, though. At the time, I couldn't have explained why. It wasn't sudden or dramatic, nothing you could point to and say, that's when it began. It was slow, like a draft seeping through the cracks, chilling everything before you realize you're cold. I told myself that Samantha just needed time to get used to having me there. After all, I was the older woman in her space, even if the deed said otherwise. I made excuses for her sharp tones, for her little sighs, when I forgot to close the cabinet doors or left my mug on the counter. I'd spent so much of my life smoothing things over that it felt easier to keep doing it than to confront anything directly. At first, the changes were small. She began by adjusting the television volume. I liked to watch the evening news after dinner, a habit from years of eating alone. But Samantha said the sound carried upstairs and made it hard for her to sleep. "Would you mind using headphones, Evelyn?" she asked one night, her voice sugary but tight. I nodded, apologizing even though it was only 8 o'clock. After that, I watched my shows on my tablet in my room. It was easier that way. A week later, she reorganized the refrigerator. "I'm just trying to keep things tidy," she explained, though it meant my groceries, my milk, my fruit were pushed to the back, behind containers labeled with her name in neat black marker. I laughed it off, told her I didn't mind. "You young people like things organized," I said, and she smiled politely, already turning away. Mark hardly noticed. He worked long hours and came home tired. When he did, Samantha was careful to play the part of the affectionate wife. She'd kiss his cheek, ask about his day, pour him a drink, and the tension that hovered between us seemed to vanish in his presence. I was careful too. I didn't want to be the mother who caused trouble. I reminded myself that he loved her, that peace was worth a few small discomforts. But peace built on silence isn't really peace at all. It's just a quiet kind of fear. Samantha began setting little rules, always wrapped in the language of kindness. "Let's all try to conserve energy," she'd say, turning off the hallway lights while I was still walking through. "It's better if we limit how long we run the washing machine," she added, just after I started a load of laundry. Once she suggested I use my own bathroom upstairs instead of the one downstairs to give everyone more privacy. She said it with a smile, but her eyes didn't smile back. I agreed, of course. Agreeing was easier. I'd spent years learning to keep my head down and my voice soft. In my generation, that's what mothers did to keep their families whole. Still, I couldn't help feeling that the house was shrinking around me. The kitchen, once a place where I baked pies and simmered stews, became off limits in subtle ways. Samantha began cooking most nights healthy recipes with strange ingredients I couldn't pronounce. When I offered to help, she'd say, "You've done enough, Evelyn. You should rest." So I'd sit quietly at the table folding napkins or pretending to read while she moved around the kitchen like a conductor, every motion controlled and deliberate. Mark would come home, smell the food, and smile. "You two make such a great team," he'd say, and Samantha would beam. I'd force a laugh, but it caught in my throat. One evening, I took out an old blanket from the closet, a heavy woolen one that had belonged to David, my husband. It still smelled faintly of cedar and the faint trace of his cologne. I spread it over the couch as I watched the rain fall outside, comforted by the weight of it across my lap. Samantha came home late, cheeks flushed from a work dinner, a glass of red wine in her hand. She looked tired, or maybe irritated. "You're still up?" she asked. "You should really get some sleep." Before I could answer, she stumbled slightly, the wine sloshing over the rim of the glass and splattering across the blanket. A deep crimson stain spread like a wound. "Oh, no," she said flatly, without much alarm. "Well, it's old anyway." I rushed to dab at it with a towel, my heart hammering. "This was David's," I said quietly. "It was his favorite." She shrugged, reaching for her phone. Accidents happen, she said. Just then, Mark walked in, half laughing, half yawning. "What's going on?" he asked. "Nothing," Samantha said before I could speak. "I spilled a little wine, but your mom's making it a whole production." He chuckled, kissed her forehead, and told me not to worry about it. "It's just a blanket, Mom." I wanted to tell him it wasn't just a blanket, that it was the one thing I kept from the life I'd lost. But the words wouldn't come. I smiled instead, muttering that it was fine. Later, I sat at the kitchen sink scrubbing the fabric until my hands ached, but the stain only spread wider. In the morning, I folded the ruined blanket and placed it in the bottom drawer of my dresser. Out of sight, out of conversation. The days that followed grew quieter, and not in a peaceful way. Samantha stopped asking for my help with dinner altogether. She changed the TV settings, rearranged the furniture, even swapped out the curtains I'd chosen for ones she said matched better. Each change was small enough to seem harmless on its own, but together they built an invisible wall around me. I could feel it closing in. I started to question myself. Was I being too sensitive, too old-fashioned, too stubborn? I told myself that maybe this was just what it felt like to grow old in someone else's world. But there were moments, brief and sharp, when I caught the look in her eyes, the satisfaction of control, the quiet ownership she felt over every inch of the house. Once, I walked into the kitchen and she was standing there rearranging the spice rack. "It's easier when things are in order," she said without turning around. I wanted to ask, whose order? But I didn't. I just nodded and walked away. That night, I lay awake listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the faint creak of the house, settling. I realized I'd stopped feeling like the owner of this home. I was a guest, a tolerated presence who took up space someone else wanted. And the worst part was, I'd let it happen. Sometimes, silence cuts deeper than cruelty. I learned that in the weeks that followed, when the house seemed to hum with things left unsaid. I tried to fill the quiet with chores, the steady rhythm of folding laundry, wiping counters, watering plants, but even those small rituals couldn't hide the tension that thickened in the air. Samantha had grown more distant, more brittle. Her cheerful greetings had turned mechanical, and her smiles no longer reached her eyes. Mark was busier than ever, staying late at work, answering texts at dinner, barely noticing the unease that had settled between his wife and me. I told myself it was just growing pains. New marriages are fragile things, I thought. They need time to find balance. But what I didn't know was that something darker had already taken root beneath the surface. It was early spring when it happened. I remember the day clearly. The rain had been falling since morning, tapping against the windows in a slow, mournful rhythm. Samantha had stayed upstairs all afternoon. I assumed she was tired from work, so I kept my distance. Around sunset, I heard a crash, a sharp metallic sound, followed by a low, choking sob. I ran up the stairs and found her in the hallway, hunched over her face, pale and slick with sweat. "Samantha," I called, but she didn't answer. Her hands were trembling, one pressed against her stomach. For a moment, time stopped. Then she whispered, "Something's wrong." The next hours passed in a blur, Mark rushing her to the hospital, me pacing the living room praying under my breath. When they returned late that night, the silence said everything. Samantha went straight upstairs without a word, and Mark sank onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. "She lost the baby," he said hoarsely. I froze, unsure what to say. I hadn't even known they were expecting. My heart ached for them, for her, but the words caught somewhere between my chest and my throat. I wanted to comfort her, but grief is a delicate thing. It can turn kindness into intrusion if you reach too soon. The next morning, I made breakfast and waited for her to come downstairs. When she finally appeared, her eyes were red, her shoulders tense. She looked smaller somehow, as if something inside her had collapsed. I tried to sound gentle. "I'm so sorry, dear. I didn't know. You're still so young, you'll have another chance." The moment the words left my mouth, I knew they were wrong. Her head snapped up her face, hardening. "Another," she repeated, her voice trembling. "You think it's that simple?" I started to explain, but she cut me off, her tone sharp enough to draw blood. "You have no idea what this feels like." She turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her untouched coffee cooling on the table. I stood there, the echo of her words hanging in the air. She was right, in a way. I didn't know what it was to lose a child before meeting them. But I did know what it meant to lose everything else, to lose your partner, your peace, your place in the world. I wanted to tell her that pain isn't a competition, that it only grows heavier when we guard it instead of sharing it. But I said nothing. I'd already hurt her once with my clumsy comfort. Silence, I thought, would be safer. In the days that followed, she avoided me completely. When I entered a room, she found a reason to leave it. Meals became quiet, functional affairs. Mark tried to bridge the gap, but he was drowning in his own helplessness. I saw it in the way he looked at her, anxious, apologetic, as though love alone could fix something that had splintered beyond his reach. I told him to be patient, to give her space. "She'll come around," I said, more for myself than for him. But deep down, I felt the chill of something changing. One afternoon, while tidying the study, I noticed the door slightly ajar. Samantha was inside, sitting at the desk, papers spread around her. I recognized the cream-colored folder immediately. It was the trust fund file. I'd kept it in the cabinet, locked away, though apparently not well enough. She didn't see me at first. Her fingers traced the words on the document, pausing on a particular line. Then she whispered softly, almost to herself, "Voluntarily relinquish." She read it again, slower this time, her expression shifting, as though something had clicked into place. If she were gone. The words were barely audible, but I heard them. I froze in the hallway, my breath catching. She turned then, spotting me at the door. For a split second, something raw and unguarded flashed in her eyes. Guilt, fear, maybe even hate. Then she smiled tightly. "Just organizing some papers," she said, closing the folder. I nodded, pretending not to notice the tremor in her voice. My hands shook as I took the documents from her, careful not to let my fear show. "These are important," I said quietly. "I'll keep them safe." She said nothing, just watched me with that same tight smile, her eyes unreadable. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the moment in my mind, the way she'd said those words, the way her tone had changed. Grief can twist people, I told myself. It makes them see enemies where there are none. She was hurt, confused. I wanted to believe that was all it was. But belief is a fragile thing. In the weeks that followed, her distance solidified into something colder. She stopped speaking to me altogether unless Mark was present. When she did, her words were precise, polite, and hollow. I'd try to ask if she needed help, if she wanted tea, if she was feeling any better. She'd nod, eyes fixed somewhere past me, and say, "I'm fine." But her tone said otherwise. I began to notice her watching me, not with open hostility, but with calculation, measuring, weighing, waiting. Mark didn't see it. Or maybe he didn't want to. He told me Samantha was healing in her own way, that she just needed time. I smiled and agreed, though I knew time wasn't what she wanted. I'd seen that look before years ago on faces that had decided forgiveness was a luxury they couldn't afford. One evening, as I passed her in the hallway, she stopped and looked at me. Her gaze was sharp, steady. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then she smiled, a small, cold smile that didn't reach her eyes. I realized then that whatever bridge had once connected us had burned quietly, leaving only ash. From that moment, her eyes no longer saw me as kin. I felt it in every glance, every word clipped short, every door that closed just a little too firmly behind me. The house had grown colder, though it was still summer. I began to avoid her as much as she avoided me, moving through the rooms quietly, careful not to disturb whatever fragile balance was left. I told myself that if I could just make it through the days without conflict, maybe things would settle again. But that was wishful thinking. Samantha had changed. Or maybe she'd simply stopped pretending. Either way, there was something sharper in her now, a cruelty that no longer hid behind civility. Labor Day weekend arrived with an unseasonal chill in the air. Mark was leaving for a 3-day work conference in Chicago, his suitcase neatly packed, his mood distracted but affectionate. "You'll be all right here with Sam, won't you, Mom?" he asked, hugging me before he left. "Of course," I said, smiling. My voice was calm, but inside I felt a knot tighten in my chest. Samantha stood by the doorway, one hand resting lightly on his arm. "Don't worry," she said, her tone light and smooth. "We'll be fine." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. After he left, the silence in the house was different, thick, watchful. I kept myself busy watering the garden, washing the dishes, organizing the pantry. Samantha spent most of the day on her phone, pacing the living room, her voice low and tense. I didn't ask who she was talking to. By evening, I decided to take a shower before bed. My back had been aching all day, and I wanted the warmth of the water to ease it. It was such a small, ordinary decision. I didn't know that those 10 minutes would become the longest 2 days of my life. The water was hot, soothing. For a few moments, I allowed myself to relax. Steam fogged the mirror, and I leaned against the tiled wall, eyes closed, breathing deeply. Then I heard the sound of heavy footsteps outside the bathroom door, then a sharp knock. Evelyn Samantha's voice was raised sharp with anger. "You're using up all the hot water again." I blinked, startled. "I've only just started," I called back. "It's been 10 minutes at most." Silence followed. Then a sound I'll never forget, the metallic click of the lock turning from the outside. At first, I thought it was a mistake. I twisted the doorknob, expecting it to give. It didn't. "Samantha," I called, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's locked." Nothing. I wrapped a towel around myself, knocking on the door harder. "Samantha, can you hear me?" Still nothing. Only the faint sound of footsteps walking away. I stood there, half-dressed, dripping water onto the cold floor, a creeping unease spreading through me. Minutes passed, then an hour. I called again, louder this time, but the only response was the distant hum of music, Samantha's music blaring from the living room. Night fell. My phone was in the bedroom. There was no chair, no window large enough to call out from, and the tiled floor grew colder as the hours stretched on. I tried knocking, yelling, even banging on the door with my fists, but no one came. I heard her once moving about the kitchen, humming softly. Then her voice low and close to the door. "You think everything's yours?" She whispered the words, muffled but clear. "Let's see what you still have now." That was the moment I understood. This wasn't an accident. She wasn't angry about the water. This was punishment, deliberate, cruel, calculated. My heart pounded my throat dry. I pressed my ear against the door, listening, but after that whisper, there was only silence again. The second night was worse. The air grew heavy with the smell of damp tile and soap. I tried drinking from the faucet, the metallic taste of the water clinging to my tongue. I sat on the floor, my legs numb, my body aching. Sometimes I thought I heard voices outside neighbors, passing a car door slamming. But when I tried to shout, the sound of music swelled louder. She was covering the noise. I knew it then. With sick certainty, she didn't want anyone to hear me. At some point, I lost track of time. I dozed and woke in short, feverish intervals, my body trembling with cold. My mind drifted to David, to the long nights we'd spent struggling to build something from nothing. I thought of Mark as a child, the way he used to reach for my hand when crossing the street. I thought of how proud I'd been to give him this house, believing I was securing his future. Now the walls that I'd bought with my own hands had become my prison. By the morning of the second day, I was too weak to shout anymore. I sat against the wall, wrapped in my towel, staring at the crack of light beneath the door. I could hear the faint sounds of breakfast being made, plates clinking, a kettle boiling. Then laughter. Hers. The sound twisted inside me like a blade. I realized she wasn't just trying to scare me. She wanted to erase me. I don't know how long it took before I heard the key again. The metallic scrape, then a soft click. The door creaked open and light spilled into the room, blinding after so much darkness. Samantha stood there, her expression calm, almost bored. She looked me over once, then said, "Next time, maybe try not to waste so much water." She turned and walked away. I stayed there on the floor, trembling, unable to speak. The part of me that had always sought peace, that had always chosen silence, cracked open like thin glass. Something colder, quieter settled in its place. Not hatred exactly, but something close. Resolve. When she opened the door, I was no longer the woman they knew. Something in me had cracked, but not in the way Samantha intended. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I simply stood up from that cold tile floor, wrapped a towel around myself, and walked past her as if she were invisible. My body was trembling, weak from hunger and exhaustion, but my mind was sharper than it had been in years. Pain has a strange way of clearing the fog. I saw everything. Then her smirk, her composure, the casual cruelty that had taken root long before this moment. I saw it all for what it was, a game I had been losing because I didn't know I was playing. Now I did. I took a shower that evening, a short one cold water only. The bruises on my legs ached as I stood beneath the spray, washing away the grime and the smell of confinement. When I looked at myself in the mirror afterward, I barely recognized the woman staring back. My face was pale, my eyes hollow, but there was something new there too. Steel, maybe, or resolve. I made myself a cup of tea, sat at the kitchen table, and listened to the quiet hum of the refrigerator. It was the first sound that hadn't felt hostile in days. For a long time, I considered calling the police. Every bone in my body told me what she'd done was wrong. But then I thought of Mark, how his voice softened when he spoke about her, how much he wanted peace, how little he understood about the woman he'd married. If I called the police, the story would become public. The neighbors would hear, the office would find out, and Mark's life would crumble overnight. He'd lose everything, his reputation, his job, his sense of stability. And even if Samantha faced consequences, the scars would stay with him forever. I couldn't do that to him. He was still my son. He was still the little boy who used to leave me notes on the counter. So I made my choice. No police, no confrontation. Not yet. When Mark returned 2 days later, he didn't notice anything was wrong. Samantha had planned it that way. She greeted him at the door with a kiss, the picture of domestic grace. "Everything fine here?" he asked, smiling. "Of course," she said. I smiled too, even managed to sound cheerful. "Everything's fine, sweetheart." My voice came out smooth, steady. Not even a tremor. If Samantha noticed, she didn't show it. Maybe she thought fear had broken me completely. She didn't realize that fear, once it burns out, leaves something colder behind. I went back to my routine as if nothing had happened. I cooked dinner, folded laundry, tended the garden. Each movement felt deliberate, like a performance. When Samantha snapped about trivial things the way I arranged the plates, the sound of the vacuum, the groceries I bought, I smiled and nodded, pretending not to hear the malice under her words. She wanted me to fight back. She wanted the satisfaction of seeing me unravel. But I'd learned in that bathroom that silence was stronger than shouting. Silence gives you time to think. Late one night, while they were both asleep, I dug through a box in my closet. Inside, beneath old letters and a few family photos, was a small tape recorder, one I'd used years ago when I gave tutoring lessons to local kids. The batteries still worked. I held it in my hand, feeling its weight, and thought about the sound of Samantha's voice through that locked door. How calm she'd been, how certain I wouldn't dare speak. I decided then that I wouldn't need to accuse her. She would accuse herself in her own words. Over the next few days, I started carrying the recorder in my apron pocket. Whenever Samantha entered the kitchen, I switched it on. I never provoked her. I didn't need to. Her cruelty came naturally. "You know, Evelyn," she said one afternoon watching me peel potatoes, "it's amazing how stubborn you are for someone your age. Most people would have retired, moved somewhere smaller, maybe not tried so hard to stay in the way." I didn't look up. Maybe I said. But I've never been one to leave things unfinished. The recorder caught every word. She laughed softly, not realizing what she'd just given me. The more she talked, the more she revealed. Little jabs veiled threats, words that dripped with contempt. "You should really be careful with your health," she said another morning. "Old people fall so easily." I smiled as I stirred the oatmeal. "You're right," I said. "I'll be careful." Inside my pocket, the tape whirred quietly, preserving every syllable. One afternoon, when they were both out, I went to the desk where the house papers were stored. I laid them out carefully on the table, my hands trembling slightly as I unfolded each one. There it was, in black and white, my name, and only mine. Evelyn Parker. Sole owner. The words looked different now, heavier somehow. I traced them with my fingertip, feeling the roughness of the ink beneath the glassy paper. For years I'd thought of this house as theirs, Mark's home. Samantha's comfort, a gift I'd given too freely. But it wasn't theirs. Not legally. Not by any measure of the law or of fairness. It was mine. The realization settled over me like armor. All the years of sacrifice, of being quiet, of giving, until there was nothing left, they had led me here. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel helpless. I felt in control. Every insult, every slight, every calculated cruelty had built the foundation for what would come next. I didn't know exactly how yet, but I would find a way to reclaim what was mine. Not through anger, not through shouting, through strategy. That night, as I sat by the window watching the lights go out in the neighboring houses, I thought about the bathroom, how I had counted the hours, then waiting for rescue. Now I would count something different. The days until freedom. The days until justice. The days until they finally learned who they were dealing with. I started counting down 3 weeks. That thought became my rhythm, the quiet drumbeat, beneath every word I spoke and every smile I forced. The days passed as though nothing had changed, but inside me, everything had shifted. I moved through the house like a ghost, calm, invisible, listening, waiting. Samantha carried on as if the past never happened. Sometimes she even hummed while she cooked, her tone light and careless. Mark, as always, was lost in work, too preoccupied to notice the subtle cracks spreading through the foundation of his life. He had no idea that while he was gone during the day, I was building something of my own, something that would change all of our lives forever. On the third morning of my silent countdown, I went to see Mr. Carson. He had been my husband's lawyer once and later a quiet friend of the family. After David died, he handled the trust paperwork, always kind but formal, never intrusive. I hadn't seen him in years, but I still remembered his office on Main Street, a small, wood-paneled space that smelled faintly of lemon polish and old books. When I walked in, he looked up from his desk, surprise flickering across his face. "Evelyn Parker," he said. "It's been a long time." "Yes," I replied, forcing a smile. "Too long." We made polite conversation for a few minutes before I placed the folder of property documents on his desk. My hands didn't shake as much as I expected them to. "I need to confirm something I said. This house, it's still mine, isn't it?" He adjusted his glasses and began leafing through the papers, his brow furrowing as he read. After a long pause, he nodded. "Yes. You're listed as sole owner. Your son is only a joint tenant in name, but you retained full rights of survivorship. If you chose to sell, you could, legally and cleanly." The words washed over me like warm water after a long freeze. I nodded slowly, absorbing the reality of it. "Then I want to sell it," I said quietly. And quickly, discreetly. He studied me for a long moment. May I ask why I met his gaze and said, "Because some homes can't be saved, and some people don't deserve the shelter you gave them?" He didn't press further. Mr. Carson had always been a man who understood boundaries. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, thinking. "There's a client of mine," he said finally, "an investor. Buys properties with cash. No mortgage, no long process. It can be done in 2 weeks if the paperwork is clean. You'd need to sign privately, though. Without your son's involvement, that's fine," I said. "He doesn't need to know, not yet." Over the next week, I visited his office twice more. We worked quietly, professionally. Mr. Carson never asked what had driven me to this, but I think he suspected. I saw it in the way he looked at me sometimes. Half pity, half admiration. The investor, a man named Lewis Grant, reviewed the property, made an offer slightly below market value. I didn't care about the number. What mattered was freedom, not profit. Mr. Carson handled the logistics. I simply had to sign when the time came. At home, I continued the charade. I cooked dinner, laughed at small talk, and tended the garden as if everything were normal. When Samantha criticized my cooking or rearranged the cabinets, I let her. When she spoke to me with that sharp edge in her voice, I smiled. I wasn't afraid anymore. I had something she didn't, a plan. And unlike her petty cruelties, mine would leave no trace of malice. Just silence and absence. One afternoon, while they were both at work, I stood in the living room looking around the space that had once been mine. The sunlight filtered through the curtains, illuminating dust motes in the air. Every corner of that house held a memory. Mark's laughter when he was small. David's voice reading the newspaper. The scent of Sunday dinners that once meant warmth instead of tension. I walked through each room slowly, touching the walls, saying goodbye in my mind. There was sadness, yes, but not regret. You can mourn a home the same way you mourn a person, by remembering what it gave you and then letting it go. That night, I opened the top drawer of my dresser and took out my passport. The cover was worn, its corners bent, but the expiration date was still good. I flipped through the pages and stopped at a faded stamp from a trip I'd taken decades ago with David to Lisbon. We'd talked about retiring there once by the sea, where the days were long and the air smelled of salt and coffee. For the first time in years, the thought didn't feel like fantasy. It felt like escape. Over the next few days, I prepared in silence. I gathered the essentials: birth certificate, bank statements, my late husband's watch, the letter he'd written to me before his surgery, and the small photo of Mark as a boy. I packed them neatly in a leather bag. No one noticed. Samantha was too absorbed in her routines, Mark too busy with work. At night, I sat at my computer searching flights, comparing costs. Portugal had become surprisingly affordable. I could live modestly there, teach English part-time, perhaps even start fresh. On the 12th day, I met Mr. Carson again. He handed me the final documents and pointed where to sign. My hand hesitated only once, hovering above the paper as I thought of Mark. Then I remembered the locked bathroom, the hours of silence, the whisper through the door. "Let's see what you still have now." I signed my name in a steady, unbroken line. "Everything will be finalized within 48 hours, Mr. Carson said, sliding the papers back into the folder. "You'll receive the funds directly into your account. No one can challenge this sale, Evelyn. Not legally." "Good," I said, standing. "Then it's done." When I stepped outside, the sky had turned gray, the air heavy with the smell of rain. I walked slowly to my car, the first drops falling on my coat. By the time I reached home, it was pouring the gutters, overflowing, the sound of thunder, distant but steady. I stood at the window watching the downpour streak against the glass, and for the first time, I didn't feel trapped by the weather or by the walls around me. The storm wasn't something to fear, it was a cleansing. The day I signed the sale papers, it rained just like the night my husband died. The sound of it carried through the house, steady and unrelenting, tapping against the windows like a metronome, marking the end of one life and the beginning of another. I sat at the kitchen table that evening, the paperwork safely tucked inside my purse, the rain slicking the glass outside into silver streaks. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about surviving the next day. I was thinking about leaving. Not running, not escaping, leaving. There's a difference. One comes from fear, the other from clarity. I'd made my decision. There would be no confrontation, no shouting, no final scene. Words had lost their meaning long ago in that house. What mattered now was action, quiet, deliberate, irreversible. The next morning I woke before sunrise. The air was still and heavy, the kind of calm that comes before a storm clears for good. I brewed a small pot of coffee and stood by the window, watching the faint light spread across the yard. The fence I had mended weeks earlier still stood firm, though the paint had chipped from the rain. I smiled at the thought. Some things endure even when they're no longer needed. I pulled out 2 sheets of paper and began to write. The first note was short, almost too simple for all it needed to say, "You'll understand one day." I folded it carefully and placed it on the kitchen counter where Mark would see it first. The second note took longer. I found an envelope, slipped $5,000 in cash inside, and wrote on the front, 3 months' rent. "I don't want you homeless." The words looked strange, as though written by someone else. Maybe they were. I was no longer the mother who stayed silent, nor the woman who waited for gratitude that never came. I was someone new, someone who finally knew her worth. As I packed, I moved slowly, methodically. A single suitcase, nothing more. Clothes for the journey, a few personal mementos, my husband's watch, my passport, and the photograph of Mark at 8 years old, grinning in front of a broken baseball bat. That photo reminded me why I'd endured so much, but it also reminded me why I had to stop. Loving him had been my purpose for so long that I'd forgotten I was a person separate from that love. Now I was reclaiming that space. Samantha and Mark were still asleep upstairs. I could hear the faint rhythm of their breathing through the ceiling, 2 people living their morning in oblivion. I stood at the base of the stairs for a long moment, listening. Part of me wanted to call out to say goodbye properly, to give Mark one last embrace. But I knew what would happen if I did. Samantha would twist it, turn my goodbye into guilt. And Mark, poor boy, would believe her. No silence would protect him more than words ever could. I left both notes on the counter beside a neatly folded dish towel, a habit of mine, one last act of order before chaos. Then I went to the hall closet and took out my coat. The keys felt heavy in my hand as I turned them over, the small brass pieces catching the light from the kitchen lamp. They weren't just keys to a house. They were the last ties to everything I'd built. Everything that had been taken from me piece by piece. I slipped them into a padded envelope, addressed to Mr. Carson, sealed it carefully, and placed it by the door. Outside, dawn had barely touched the horizon. The world was hushed, washed clean from the night's rain. I loaded my suitcase into the taxi that had been waiting quietly by the curb. The driver, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, helped me with the bag. "Early flight?" he asked. "Yes," I said, "a new start." He nodded, understanding more than I'd said. As the car pulled away, I looked back at the house one last time. The windows were dark, the curtains drawn. It looked peaceful, almost innocent. No one would guess what had happened behind those walls, the whispers, the cruelty, the long nights of waiting. I felt no hatred, only distance, like watching the closing scene of a movie I'd already seen too many times. We drove through the quiet streets, the town still half asleep. When we stopped at the post office, I handed the envelope with the house keys to the clerk. "It's important it reaches Mr. Carson by noon," I said. She promised it would. As I stepped back outside, the sun was rising pale gold, breaking through a thin mist. I took a deep breath, the air sharp and clean, and for the first time in years I felt free to inhale without fear of who might be listening. At the airport, I moved through the motions of departure, like someone walking through a dream. Security lines, ticket counters, the soft hum of announcements. My flight to Lisbon left in 2 hours. I bought a small coffee, sat by the window, and watched the planes take off one after another, each one vanishing into the distance like a promise. When they called my flight, I stood and felt an odd calm settle over me. Not joy, not sorrow, just peace. Back at the house, somewhere around the same hour, sunlight would have begun to stream through the curtains. Samantha would wake first, reach for her phone, probably scroll through messages before heading downstairs. Mark would follow, yawning, maybe asking if there was coffee. They'd find the notes, then one folded neatly, one sealed with cash. Maybe they'd argue, maybe they'd panic. But by the time they called Mr. Carson, it would already be too late. As the plane lifted off the ground, I looked down through the small oval window, watching the town shrink beneath me. The roads twisted like threads leading back to the house I no longer owned, the life I no longer needed. Somewhere below, the movers and the new owners would be arriving, carrying boxes, unlocking doors. And in a kitchen that once smelled of bread and coffee, my son and his wife would stand stunned, realizing that everything they thought was theirs had vanished overnight. By the time they woke, the house wasn't theirs anymore. I didn't see it happen, of course, but I could picture it clearly, every expression, every word, every frantic movement. I imagined Samantha descending the stairs first, still half asleep, expecting coffee and sunlight and the illusion of control. Instead, she would find strangers standing in the living room, men in uniforms hauling boxes, their hands steady and professional. The buyers would be polite, firm, explaining that the sale had closed 2 days prior. Somewhere in that moment, her world would shift, just as mine had weeks ago on the cold bathroom floor. The difference was, I had walked out of my prison. She was only beginning to see hers. As the plane cut through the morning clouds, I looked down at the coastline fading beneath me. A part of me wondered if Mark had seen the note yet. I could picture him standing beside the counter, his hand trembling as he unfolded the paper. He would read my words once, twice, maybe 3 times before they sank in. "You'll understand one day." I hoped he would. I hoped he'd see that it wasn't about revenge, not really. It was about freedom, about the moment a woman realizes she doesn't owe her silence to anyone anymore. Meanwhile, back in that kitchen, chaos must have been unraveling. Samantha's voice, sharp, disbelieving, demanding answers no one could give. "This is a mistake," she'd say, waving her hands, panic creeping into her tone. "You can't just take our house." The buyer, a young man in a pressed suit, would hand her the paperwork, the official signatures, the legal seals. "Ma'am," he'd say gently, "this property was sold and transferred through the county last week. Ownership belongs to us now." I could imagine her face then, confusion turning to rage curdling into fear. She would call Mark, her voice shaking, but he'd still be reading my note, unable to process what was happening. By the time the police arrived, there would be nothing for them to do. The sale was clean, the documents valid, the transaction final. The officers would confirm it with Mr. Carson, who would be expecting the call. Mr. Carson had promised me he would deliver one last envelope to Mark that morning. Inside was a copy of the trust fund papers, the same ones Samantha had once found and twisted into her weapon of greed. But this time, the words would come with context. On top of the documents, folded carefully, was a small note in my handwriting. "Use this only when you truly need it, not to hold someone else." I could see the moment Mark opened it, the realization dawning slowly, painfully. He'd understand that I had known everything, the resentment, the whispering behind closed doors, the slow erosion of kindness. He'd see that I had watched it all, loved him anyway, and still chosen to protect him. The trust fund wasn't just money. It was a test of character, a mirror to reveal what greed could turn someone into. And Samantha had failed it long before she ever locked that bathroom door. Samantha, I imagined, would tear through the house, searching for some loophole, some piece of evidence that might undo what I had done. But there would be none. Every document filed, every signature witnessed, every penny accounted for. The more she tried to fight it, the deeper she would sink into the truth that she'd been outplayed by a woman who never once shouted, who never once threatened, who simply waited for the right moment to act. I pictured her then, collapsing into one of the empty chairs, staring at the floor as movers carried out the furniture she had once claimed as hers. Maybe she would remember her own words. "Let's see what you still have now." Maybe she would finally understand the cruelty of them. Because now she was the one watching her world vanish piece by piece. Mark, I hoped, would handle it differently. He would grieve, of course. Losing a home, even one filled with tension, still wounds the heart. But perhaps he would also begin to see beyond Samantha's tears. He would see how I'd left him not with ruin, but with choice, the trust fund untouched, a reminder that his future was still his, to shape untainted by manipulation. As the plane continued across the Atlantic, I stared at the soft horizon where sea met sky. Below me, clouds rolled like pale waves, endless and quiet. I thought of David, then my husband, and wondered what he'd say if he could see me now. He'd probably smile, that slow, knowing smile of his, and say, "You finally did it, Eve. You finally stood up." Maybe I had. Or maybe I'd simply learned that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, moves quietly, leaves behind clean lines and no apologies. I didn't feel joy, not yet. What I felt was stillness. The noise of years of compromise had finally faded. My hands rested on my lap, steady, as the engines hummed beneath me. Somewhere far below, the people I'd once called family were discovering the cost of taking someone's kindness for weakness. When the flight attendant came by to offer coffee, I accepted it with a polite smile. The warmth of the cup seeped into my palms, grounding me. I didn't look back again. Whatever storm raged behind me would pass on its own. I had no part in it anymore. I'd done what needed to be done, not for vengeance, but for peace. And perhaps that's what justice really is, not a loud reckoning, but the quiet correction of balance. The kind that doesn't need an audience or applause, only understanding. Sometimes, silence is the sharpest verdict. That thought stayed with me long after the plane landed, echoing in the quiet hum of the airport in Faro, then in the steady rhythm of the taxi wheels as we drove south along the coast. The driver pointed out the sea now, and then a strip of blue glinting between the hills, but I barely spoke. My English felt too heavy for this place, my thoughts still tethered to another continent. When we reached Lagos, the air smelled of salt and something sweet, maybe the almond trees in bloom. The town was older than anything I'd ever known, the streets narrow and cobbled, the walls whitewashed and sun-worn. It felt like a place built for forgetting. I found a small apartment near the water, a single room with a balcony that overlooked a courtyard full of orange trees. The landlord, an elderly man with kind eyes, spoke slow, careful English. "Quiet place," he said, smiling as he handed me the keys. "Good for rest." He didn't know how right he was. The apartment was modest, just enough space for a bed, a table, and a narrow kitchen, but the light poured in each morning like forgiveness. I unpacked the few things I'd brought with me, my husband's watch, the photo of Mark as a boy, and a thin notebook where I planned to write down what the sea might teach me. The first few days were strange. I'd wake before dawn, still expecting the sound of footsteps above me, the clatter of dishes, the sharp call of my name from another room. But there was only the distant cry of gulls and the slow, rhythmic breath of the waves. I began to walk each morning along the promenade, watching the fishermen cast their nets and the tourists drink coffee at the cafes. It was a simple routine, but it filled the empty spaces in me that had gone untouched for years. I didn't know anyone there until I met Maria. She lived 2 floors below me, a widow from Lisbon, who had come to Lagos after her husband's death. We met when I accidentally dropped a small bag of groceries, and she bent down to help me pick them up. "American," she asked, her accent soft and musical. I nodded, and she smiled. Then we both ran away from something. It was the beginning of a quiet friendship. Maria was a woman of stories. She had 3 grown children who hadn't spoken to her in years, though she never said why. "They think I was too strict," she told me once, stirring sugar into her coffee. But strictness is how I loved them. Some people don't understand that. I did. We would sit together in the afternoons on the balcony, the air filled with the scent of oranges, talking about things that hurt less when spoken aloud. She taught me a few words of Portuguese. I taught her how to make American pancakes, though she said they were too sweet. Sometimes we sat in silence, and even that felt like conversation. Money wasn't a problem for now. The sale of the house had given me enough to live comfortably, though I didn't want to simply exist. I needed something to fill my days. Through an online forum for expats, I found a small company that hired retired teachers to tutor Portuguese children in English. The work was simple, the pay modest, but it gave me purpose. The children's voices, bright and unfiltered, reminded me that life could still be innocent, that kindness could still sound unbroken. I'd log off after each lesson, smiling, something I hadn't done without effort in a long time. At night, though, when the world quieted, the peace sometimes fractured. Lying in bed, I would hear it, the soft, steady drip of water. It wasn't from the faucet or the rain. I'd checked both. It came from somewhere deeper, the echo of that bathroom, the memory my mind refused to release. I'd close my eyes and try to drown it with the sound of the sea outside, but it always returned. Trauma is like that. It lingers not where you expect, but in the stillness you think you've earned. Maria noticed once. We were drinking tea on her balcony, and I must have flinched at some unseen sound. "You still hear it?" she said quietly. Not as a question, but as a truth. I nodded. She reached across the small table and touched my hand. "Then you must listen," she said, "until it becomes something else." That night I tried. I sat by the window, the glass open to the soft breeze, and listened to the dripping that lived somewhere inside me. It no longer frightened me, not entirely. It was a reminder of what I had endured, of what I had survived. I realized healing wasn't about silence after all. It was about learning which sounds to carry forward. Weeks passed, and the rhythm of my life found its own quiet pulse. Morning walks, tutoring sessions, tea with Maria. I planted herbs in a small pot on the balcony and learned the names of the neighbors' cats. I even laughed once, a real laugh, when a little boy I was tutoring called me teacher grandma. The sound surprised me. It had been so long since laughter had felt natural. The loneliness didn't vanish, but it softened around the edges. Sometimes in the evenings I'd walk down to the beach and watch the sun melt into the water. The sky would turn to fire, then to ash, and I'd feel something I couldn't name, something like peace, but not quite. Perhaps it was gratitude, or perhaps it was simply the absence of fear. Either way, it was enough. One morning, I woke early to the sound of the gulls and the soft murmur of the ocean. The light was golden, spilling across the floor in gentle waves. I brewed coffee and stepped onto the balcony, breathing in the salt and citrus air. Everything felt still, suspended, as though the world itself were holding its breath. Then from inside, I heard a sound that didn't belong. A faint vibration, sharp and unexpected. My phone, buried beneath a stack of papers, was ringing. I reached for it slowly, my hands trembling as I read the name on the screen. One morning, the phone rang, my son's name on the screen. For a moment, I simply stared at it, frozen. The letters looked strange, as if they belonged to another life. My heart began to race, a familiar panic rising in my chest, the kind that comes from expecting bad news. My fingers trembled as I reached for the phone. I hadn't heard his voice in months, not since I'd left that house, not since I'd chosen silence over explanation. I pressed the answer button, and for a few seconds neither of us spoke. I could hear him breathing uneven and shallow. Then through the static of distance came a sound I hadn't heard since he was a child, the sound of my son crying. "Mom," he said finally, his voice cracking. "She's gone. Samantha left me." There was a long pause, and then the words that followed came out like a confession. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry." I closed my eyes and took a slow breath. The ocean outside my window was calm, a soft whisper against the rocks below. I wanted to say something comforting, something to ease the pain in his voice, but I knew that empty comfort wouldn't help either of us. So I stayed quiet, letting him speak. "She took what was left of our savings," he continued, the words tumbling out through sobs. "She said she couldn't live with the shame anymore, that I was weak, that I ruined everything." His voice broke again. "Maybe she's right. Maybe I did." "No," I said softly, finally finding my voice. "You didn't ruin anything, Mark." He was silent, but I could hear him breathing on the other end, waiting for me to go on. I looked around the small apartment, the morning light spilling across the floor, and thought of all the things I had carried, the love, the loss, the silence. My hand tightened around the phone. "When you were 8, I said quietly, I almost ended my life." There was a sound on the other end, a sharp intake of breath, then nothing, only silence. I could picture him sitting there stunned, trying to understand what I had just said. I had never told anyone. Not even David, not my closest friend. It was a truth buried so deep I thought it might die with me. But somehow in that moment, I knew it was time. After your father died, I went on, my voice steady but trembling underneath. I didn't think I could go on. I had no money, no family to turn to. I would come home from work and sit in the dark after you fell asleep, wondering if you'd be better off without me. I paused, my throat tightening. But then one night, I heard you talking in your sleep. You said, "Mom, don't leave me." Just like that. Clear as day, and I didn't. I could hear a soft sound through the phone, something like a muffled sob. Mom. I lived for you then, Mark, I said. Every morning I got up, every job I took, every meal I skipped. I did it because I thought my life didn't belong to me anymore. I thought it belonged to you. I took a deep breath, the words coming out softer now, almost a whisper. But now I have to live for me. There was a long silence. I could hear him trying to speak, stopping, starting again, but no words came. The only sound was the faint hum of the line, the ocean murmuring outside my window. I imagined him there in that kitchen, surrounded by emptiness, the walls bare, the rooms hollow. I imagined the boy he once was, sitting on the edge of his bed, scared and waiting for his mother to come home. Maybe in a way that boy had never really grown up. Finally, his voice broke through, raw and small. I understand now. I pressed the phone tighter against my ear, eyes stinging. Do you? I asked gently. Yes, he said. I didn't see it before. What she did to you, what I did to you. I just kept thinking you'd always be there no matter what. I thought love was supposed to hurt a little. His voice cracked again. I was wrong. Tears blurred my vision. The apartment felt both too small and too wide, filled with everything I'd wanted to say for years but couldn't. We all learn when we're ready, I said softly. Sometimes it takes losing what we think we own to understand what love really is. He didn't answer right away. I could hear him crying again quietly this time, like a man who had finally stopped running from himself. And I realized then that forgiveness isn't a gift you give. It's a space you open, a door that waits until the other person is brave enough to step through. Mom, he said finally, his voice trembling. I miss you. I smiled through the tears, staring out at the waves breaking against the shore. I miss you too, I whispered. But maybe this is how we find each other again. From far away in the quiet. He didn't speak again after that. I could hear him breathing steady now, calmer. I wanted to hold him, to brush the hair from his forehead the way I used to, but distance is its own kind of mercy. We stayed on the line like that, two people bound by pain and release, saying everything through silence. When the call finally ended, I sat there for a long time, the phone still warm in my hand. The morning light had grown brighter, the sea shimmering just beyond the window. I felt emptied and full all at once, as though the years between us had collapsed in that single conversation. And then, as the waves crashed softly against the shore, I let go. I hung up and cried like I never had before. The tears came fast and heavy, but they weren't just for grief anymore. They were for release, for every moment I had swallowed pain in silence, for every time I'd chosen peace over truth. When the sobs finally subsided, I sat there staring at the phone still resting in my palm. Outside, the sea moved with its patient rhythm, the light glimmering across the water, as if it too understood what it meant to let go. For the first time, I felt no bitterness toward what had happened. I thought the story was finished. But stories I've learned have their own way of finding an ending. It began 2 weeks later with an unexpected email from Mr. Carson. His messages were always formal, so when I saw the subject line, "Update on the trust," I knew something was wrong. I called him immediately, and he answered on the first ring. "Evelyn." He said, his tone steady, but edged with concern. "I think Samantha has made a move." I felt a chill run through me. "What kind of move? She's been impersonating you," he said. "She contacted the bank and the trust administrator claiming you were back in the States and needed to transfer funds into a joint account. Fortunately, the bank grew suspicious. Her story didn't match the security answers we established." I exhaled slowly, half in shock, half in grim recognition. "I expected she might try something like that," I said. "You did?" he asked, surprised. "Yes," I said. "I've known her kind of desperation. It's quiet until it's cornered." Before I left America, I had spent one last afternoon in Mr. Carson's office handing him 2 envelopes. One contained copies of the real trust fund papers. The other contained a set of forged ones identical, except for a few subtle changes. "If anyone ever contacts you pretending to be me," I'd told him, "give them these." The forged version had an unmistakable watermark only I could identify. It would expose anyone trying to misuse it. At the time, he'd looked puzzled, but he'd done as I asked. Now the plan was working exactly as intended. She used the fake documents he confirmed. The authorities were notified immediately. "I've already forwarded them the recording you left with me, the one from your house." I closed my eyes. That old tape recorder, the one that had sat in my apron pocket capturing her words like poison in a vial, had finally found its purpose. I remembered the things she'd said so carelessly, never imagining her voice would one day betray her. "You old parasite. You should be grateful we let you stay here at all." And that one phrase, the one that had burned itself into my memory, "Let's see what you still have now." It was all on the recording. Every word, every cruel inflection. "She's been charged with attempted fraud and elder abuse," Carson continued. "They're building the case now. You don't have to do anything. Just stay where you are." I sat in silence for a long time after the call ended, my mind turning over the strange symmetry of it all. I hadn't lifted a finger. I hadn't needed to. The same arrogance that made her cruel had led her straight into her own undoing. Justice hadn't come because I demanded it. It had arrived quietly in its own time, like the tide rolling back to claim what had been stolen. A week later, Mark called again. His voice was heavy, tired, different from before. "Mom," he said, "they arrested her." There was no anger in his tone, only exhaustion. "She tried to use your name. She even forged your signature. I didn't believe it at first, but—" His words broke off into silence. I didn't rush him. When he finally spoke again, his voice cracked. "I let her do it. Not this, but before. The way she treated you. I saw it and I didn't stop it. I told myself it was just tension that she'd come around. But she never did. And I let her take everything good out of that house." I swallowed hard, my throat aching. "You were young, Mark," I said. "You wanted peace. Sometimes we choose blindness because it hurts less than seeing." He was quiet for a moment. Then he whispered, "She said you planned all of this to destroy us." I looked out at the waves, their endless rise and fall. "No," I said softly. "I planned to survive. There's a difference." He didn't respond right away, but I could sense the weight lifting from him even through the silence. "You always were stronger than I thought," he said finally. "No," I replied. "I just stopped being afraid." When the call ended, I set the phone down and walked out to the balcony. The air smelled of salt and rain. the evening sun reflecting off the water in streaks of gold. Somewhere far away in a courtroom or an office, Samantha's name was being written into records she could never erase. I didn't feel triumph. What I felt was balance, the kind of quiet that follows a long, dark storm. I thought of the young woman she might have been, once the one who could have built something beautiful instead of tearing it apart. But choices define us more than circumstances ever do. She'd made hers, and I had made mine. As the last light of day faded over the Atlantic, I felt something inside me settle for the first time in years. I didn't need revenge. Justice came on its own. After that, the days in Portugal passed more gently. The sea was still there every morning, faithful as breath, and my small apartment had begun to feel less like exile and more like home. I tended my herbs, taught my lessons, and shared coffee with Maria in the courtyard. Life was quiet, and for the first time in years that quiet didn't frighten me. It simply was. Then one afternoon, I heard a knock at my door. When I opened it, I froze. Samantha stood there. She looked nothing like the woman I remembered. The sharpness in her eyes was gone, replaced by something hollow and trembling. Her hair was pulled back loosely, her face pale and thinner than I'd ever seen it. And standing beside her, half hidden behind a worn backpack, was Eli. He was taller now, maybe 6, with the same brown eyes as Mark. He clutched a small stuffed bear to his chest. "Evelyn," she began, her voice breaking on my name. "I know I shouldn't be here, but I didn't know where else to go." I didn't answer, just watched her struggle with the words. I'm going into rehab," she said finally, "for prescription pills. I've been using them since everything fell apart. I can't take care of Eli right now. Mark's working overseas. I need help." For a moment, all I could hear was the sea outside, the slow pulse of the waves hitting the rocks below. Every instinct in me screamed to say no. I remembered the locked door, the cold floor, the way she had laughed through my pain. But then Eli looked up at me, his small hand gripping the edge of my sleeve, his eyes wide and uncertain. "Grandma," he said softly, testing the word like it might break. Something inside me shifted. I stepped aside. "Come in," I said. Samantha hesitated as though she couldn't believe it. Then she nodded and guided Eli inside. She handed me a small envelope with the rehab address, her hand shaking. "It's a 6-week program," she whispered. "If you can just—" "I'll take care of him," I interrupted gently. "Go." She met my eyes then, and for a fleeting second, I saw not the cruel woman who had hurt me, but a frightened mother desperate to make things right. She mouthed a quiet, "Thank you," kissed Eli's head, and left. I stood at the window as she walked away down the narrow street, her shoulders hunched against the wind. That evening, the apartment felt different. Smaller but warmer somehow. Eli sat cross-legged on the rug, building a tower out of seashells he found on the balcony. "This one's the castle," he said proudly, holding up the largest shell. "And this one's the dragon." I smiled despite myself. "Then, who's the knight I asked?" He grinned. "You." His laughter filled the room like sunlight spilling into corners that had been dim for too long. I made him dinner, simple pasta and fruit, and watched him eat with the kind of focus that only children have. Afterward, he asked if he could sleep in my bed just tonight. I agreed, though I sat up long after he drifted off, listening to his soft breathing. In the following days, our lives found an easy rhythm. We walked to the beach in the mornings, collecting shells and skipping stones. In the afternoons, while I taught online, he would draw beside me his pictures full of bright colors and impossible creatures. Sometimes he'd hum quietly to himself, and the sound would carry me back to Mark's childhood when the world still felt kind. At night before bed, Eli would bring me a storybook, always the same one about a bear who finds his way home after getting lost in the woods. I'd read aloud, my voice steady and soft, while he curled against my side, fighting sleep. When I finished, he'd whisper, "Again," and I'd laugh, pretending to protest before starting over. One night, as he yawned and closed his eyes, I brushed the hair from his forehead and felt an ache I hadn't known I still carried. So much had been lost, and yet here was something pure, unbroken, returned to me in a form I never expected. I kissed his cheek and whispered into the quiet, "This is how it should have begun." The waves outside murmured their endless song, and I sat there long after he fell asleep, watching the moonlight dance across the floor. Maybe life doesn't give us second chances in the way we hope, but sometimes it offers small mercies, a child's laughter, a moment of peace, a hand that reaches for yours without fear. Perhaps the boy saved my soul. After Samantha left for the rehab center, the apartment settled into a quiet rhythm once more. Eli stayed with me through the summer, and his laughter became the pulse of my days. He filled the rooms with drawings and questions, the kind that only a child could ask. Why waves never get tired, why oranges smell like sunshine, why grandmas always know the right stories. I didn't know all the answers, but he didn't seem to mind. When September came, Samantha called from the clinic to say she would be staying longer. Her voice was steadier, her tone softer. I could hear humility in it, and something like hope. A week later, her first letter arrived. It was written in neat, careful handwriting, as if every word cost her effort. "Evelyn," it began, "I've spent weeks trying to understand why I did what I did. I think I finally know. I was jealous. Not of your strength or your place in Mark's life, but because he loved you more. I wanted that kind of love, the kind that doesn't waver. Instead, I ruined it. I ruined myself. If you can't forgive me, I understand. But please tell Eli I'm trying to be better." The letter trembled slightly in my hands when I finished reading. For a long time, I said nothing. I simply looked out at the sea where the light danced and broke on the surface, and thought of how jealousy begins in the shadow of love. That night, I took a photograph of Eli and me sitting on the balcony, both of us smiling at the camera, his small hand wrapped around mine. I printed the photo, slipped it into an envelope, and wrote a single line on the back. "Thank you for letting him know love." It wasn't forgiveness in the way people think of it, but it was peace, the kind that comes when you finally stop asking why. A few days later, another letter came, this one from Mark. The handwriting was familiar, hurried and full of smudged ink, as if written through tears. "Mom," it began, "I've been thinking about everything, about how blind I was. I can't change the past, but I see now what you tried to teach me all along, that love without respect becomes dependence. I failed you in ways I can't put into words. I don't expect forgiveness, but I need you to know I'm sorry." I read it twice, then took out a plain sheet of paper and wrote back, "No need, just live right." It was all I wanted for him, all I'd ever wanted. That evening, after Eli went to bed, I took both letters and placed them beside my husband's photograph on the small table near the window. The photo had faded with time. David's smile now just a soft blur of light, but it still felt alive. I imagined him looking at me at the letters and nodding. We had done what parents are meant to do, not protect our children from pain, but teach them how to rise from it. The waves outside whispered their endless lullaby, the same one that had carried me through loss and into life again. The house smelled faintly of salt and lemons, the sound of Eli's soft breathing drifting from the next room. I stood there for a long while, tracing the edges of the photo with my fingers, feeling the calm that comes only when every loose thread finally finds its knot. But there's still one secret I haven't told. It's not about what I did in anger or what I endured in silence. It's about what I chose to do after the tears stopped, when the quiet became my companion and not my punishment. In the weeks after those letters arrived, I found myself thinking about the future, not my own, but Eli's. He had returned to the States with his mother, and though the apartment felt emptier without his laughter, I knew he was where he needed to be. Samantha had completed her program and was working at the same clinic that had helped her recover. Mark wrote often short messages filled with cautious hope. Life, it seemed, had begun to rebuild itself piece by fragile piece. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something of mine remained unfinished. One afternoon, sitting by the window with my notebook, I opened the folder that contained the remaining trust fund papers. That money, once the symbol of greed and conflict, now felt like something that could heal instead of harm. I called Mr. Carson. I want to create a new trust, I told him, for Eli. There was a pause on the line, the kind of silence that holds both surprise and understanding. "And his guardian?" he asked. I hesitated for only a moment. "Samantha," I said, "but with conditions." Together we drafted the terms. The fund would support Eli's education and his future, but it would also test Samantha's strength. If she stayed clean, the money would remain under her guardianship until Eli turned 18. But if she relapsed, if she fell back into addiction, or the patterns that had once consumed her, the entire trust would transfer automatically to a foundation for women's shelters across the United States. I chose that clause not as punishment, but as protection. I wanted her to understand that love once broken could only be mended through responsibility. When the documents were signed, I felt a strange calm settle over me. This was the final chapter I hadn't known how to write. I didn't need to erase the past. I only needed to give it meaning. That night, I took out my journal and wrote in neat, deliberate handwriting, "I didn't take back the house. I took back my life." The next morning, I walked down to the beach before sunrise. The air was cool, the horizon painted with faint strokes of pink and gold. Fishermen were already gathering by the shore, their voices low and steady. I carried my journal with me and sat on a rock close enough to feel the mist on my skin. For years, water had been my enemy, the thing that reminded me of fear, of confinement, of helplessness. Now it moved in front of me, endless and alive, and I realized it had never been the water itself that hurt me. It was what had been taken from me inside that room. My sense of worth, my right to peace, my belief that I could begin again. I closed my eyes and listened. The waves came and went, their rhythm as familiar as breath. I thought of Samantha, of the woman she was becoming. I thought of Mark learning how to be a better man. And I thought of Eli, that bright little boy with his seashell castles and his boundless laughter, carrying pieces of all of us into a life I would never fully see, but would always believe in. As the sun broke over the horizon, light touched the water like a blessing. I opened my journal once more, added a final line beneath my last entry, and smiled. Some stories don't end with apologies or grand gestures. They end quietly in the soft sound of the tide, in the small mercy of letting go. The sea shimmered alive with color and promise. I rose, slipping my shoes off to feel the sand beneath my feet cool and smooth. A thin stream of water trickled from the rocks nearby, catching the light as it ran down to meet the ocean. I stood there watching it, listening to the gentle rush. It no longer made me shiver. For the first time, I heard running water, and it didn't feel cold. For the first time, I heard running water, and it didn't feel cold. Maybe that's what healing truly is, when the things that once broke you become part of your peace. We all carry pain that doesn't show on the surface, but time, kindness, and forgiveness, especially toward ourselves, can turn even the deepest wounds into quiet strength. Some people find that peace through travel, prayer, journaling, or simply sitting by the sea, letting the world remind them that life goes on. If Evelyn's story reached something inside you, if it made you remember your own moments of courage or loss, take a breath and hold on to that feeling. Healing takes time, but it comes. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, stories about finding light after the storm, consider subscribing and sharing your thoughts below. Your story might be the one that helps someone else begin again.